There are moments in life when betrayal doesn't arrive loudly. It sits across from you at your own kitchen table, smiles the way it always has, and calls you mom. Before I begin, let me ask you something quietly. Where are you listening from right now? Your car, your kitchen, maybe a long night shift? Because this story begins in a place that once felt just as safe. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 69 years old, and until last winter, I believed the most dangerous thing that could happen to an aging woman in America was loneliness. I was wrong. The truth is far colder. The most dangerous thing is misplaced trust, especially when it wears the face of your own child. I spent my life doing everything the right way. I worked for 43 years as a property administrator in Northern California, saved carefully, never lived beyond my means, never asked anyone for help. When my husband passed away 8 years ago, I didn't crumble. I adjusted. I downsized emotionally, not financially. And when I sold my last commercial property, a small office complex I'd managed since the early 90s, for $2 million, it wasn't greed or luxury that motivated me. It was dignity. That money was meant to secure my independence, long-term care, medical freedom, the ability to choose how I would age without burdening anyone, especially my son, Ethan, 42 years old, MBA, married, 2 kids. The kind of man neighbors admire and banks trust. The kind of man who once cried in my arms when he scraped his knee and promised he'd always take care of me. When I told him about the sale, he didn't congratulate me. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said the words that would quietly dismantle my life. "Mom, that's a lot of money to hold alone. Let me help you protect it." And in that moment, sitting at my own table, with sunlight on the counter and my son's hand resting over mine, I made the most expensive mistake of my life. At first, nothing about Ethan's involvement felt suspicious. In fact, it felt responsible, almost comforting. He spoke in calm, measured sentences, the way professionals do when they want you to relax. He explained estate planning, tax exposure, temporary structures, and how sudden liquidity could attract predators, lawsuits, or bad actors. He said all the right things, and I nodded along because I wanted to believe him, because trusting your own child feels safer than trusting the world. He suggested placing the $2 million into a short-term holding account under an LLC he would help manage, purely administrative, he said. "You'll still own everything, Mom. This is just to shield it while we set up a proper trust." He even brought documents printed neatly in folders, color-coded tabs, legal language that looked official enough to lull my instincts into silence. I asked questions, small ones. He answered quickly, confidently, never defensive. When I hesitated, he smiled and said, "You raised me better than this. I'd never touch a dollar that isn't yours." That line landed like a soft blanket over my doubt, so I signed. Not everything, just enough, he said, to get things started. A power of attorney limited for transactional purposes. A co-signature for fund movement only if necessary. It didn't feel like surrender, it felt like teamwork. Weeks passed, then months. I received statements, summaries, emails forwarded from advisors I'd never met but whose signatures appeared impressive. Ethan checked in often. "Everything's solid, Mom. Market's volatile, but we're safe." I believed him, until the day my bank called asking why I was attempting to access funds that were no longer fully under my control. The woman on the phone sounded apologetic, almost embarrassed for me. "Mrs. Hale," she said carefully, "the majority of those assets have been transferred out of your direct ownership." My stomach dropped, but my voice stayed calm. "Transferred where?" There was a pause. Then, "To an entity where you are listed as a minor beneficiary, not the primary." I remember hanging up and sitting very still, staring at the wall, replaying every conversation, every smile, every reassuring word my son had spoken. That was the moment the truth crept in, not screaming, not dramatic, but sharp and precise. The $2 million were no longer mine, and the betrayal wasn't coming from a stranger. It was coming from the boy I had trusted more than myself. I did confront Ethan right away. That surprised even me. Instead, I did what I've always done when something felt wrong. I observed. I reread the documents he'd given me, slowly this time, line by line, without the comforting soundtrack of his voice explaining things away. Words that once looked harmless now felt heavy. Irrevocable provisions, managerial discretion, contingent interest. The language wasn't illegal. That was the most painful part. It was precise, calculated. Designed by someone who knew exactly how much trust a mother would give before she started asking the wrong questions. I called the number listed for the LLC, voicemail. I emailed one of the advisors whose name appeared on the statements. The reply came hours later, brief, professional, distant. "We communicate through Mr. Hale." Not with me, through him. That's when the pattern snapped into focus. Every path led back to my son. Every door I tried to open quietly redirected me to the same gatekeeper. Ethan. That night he came over for dinner like nothing had changed. Brought wine. Hugged me the way he always had. Asked about my knees, my sleep, whether I was still walking in the mornings. I watched him carefully as he talked, noticing things I'd never noticed before, the way he avoided specifics, how his reassurance was always broad, never concrete. When I mentioned the bank's call, his fork paused for half a second too long. Just half a second, then he smiled. "Yeah, that was probably confusing. Banks don't always understand these structures. I'll handle it." I'll handle it. Not we'll fix it. Not let me explain. Handle it like a problem already solved, like something that no longer belonged to me. That was the moment something inside me hardened. Not into anger, but into clarity. I realized then that the $2 million weren't the real loss. The real theft was subtler. My authority, my voice, my right to decide what happened to what I had earned. He hadn't just moved money. He'd quietly repositioned me, from owner to obstacle, from mother to liability. And as I cleared the dinner plates and listened to him talk about long-term vision, I understood something chillingly simple. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. And it had been unfolding while I was busy being proud of the man my son had become. That night, after Ethan left, I didn't sleep. Not because I was panicked, but because my mind was finally awake in a way it hadn't been in years. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, writing down everything I could remember, dates, phrases, promises, the exact wording he used when he first suggested protecting the money. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped defending him in my head. He'd always framed decisions as urgent but vague. He discouraged me from involving my longtime accountant, saying it would slow things down. He'd positioned himself as the only bridge between me and the complexity of modern finance. And worst of all, he'd wrapped every maneuver in concern for my age, my health, my supposed vulnerability. "You shouldn't have to worry about this anymore, Mom." That sentence echoed now like a quiet insult. By dawn, I knew confrontation would be useless. If I accused him directly, he'd deny, deflect, overwhelm me with jargon, maybe even suggest I was confused. I needed leverage, not emotion. So I made calls, careful ones. Not to friends, not to family, but to professionals Ethan didn't know. A forensic accountant recommended by a retired judge. A trust litigation attorney who specialized in elder financial abuse. I didn't use dramatic language when I spoke to them. I didn't say, "My son betrayed me." I said, "I believe control of my assets was transferred under misleading representations." Those words mattered. They unlocked doors. Within days, we uncovered the full scope. The $2 million had been routed through layered entities, technically compliant but strategically opaque, positioning Ethan as managing partner with sweeping discretion. I was listed, yes, but as someone whose consent could be overridden under the guise of best interest. The attorney looked at me across her desk and said very calmly, "He didn't steal from you. He replaced you." That sentence settled into my bones. Because it explained everything. The confidence, the patience, the lack of fear. Ethan wasn't worried because, on paper, he had already won. And that's when I decided something else, just as calmly. If he thought this was a game of paperwork and patience, then he had underestimated the one thing I still had in abundance: time, memory, and the will to finish what someone else started. I didn't move quickly after that. I moved quietly. That was the mistake Ethan had made. He assumed urgency would force me into panic. Instead, clarity taught me patience. While he continued managing my money, I let him believe his plan was airtight. I answered his calls warmly. I asked harmless questions. I let him explain things I already knew were half-truths. Every conversation became a record. every email a thread, every reassurance a timestamp. The forensic accountant showed me how to document intent without alerting the other party, how patterns, not accusations, win cases like this. We mapped the flow of funds, traced advisory fees, management expenses, and strategic reallocations that quietly benefited entities tied back to Ethan. Nothing blatant, nothing sloppy, which told us something important. This wasn't desperation. This was confidence born of practice. Meanwhile, I began restructuring what he didn't control. My remaining accounts, my property, my beneficiary designations. I updated my will. I placed assets into a new trust with language so precise it left no room for interpretation. Most importantly, I revoked every informal permission I'd ever given him, replacing trust by assumption with authority by law. When the attorney asked if I wanted to notify him, I shook my head. Not yet, because timing matters. Because truth is most powerful when it arrives fully formed, not as a warning. Ethan continued his life unaware. He talked about expanding the portfolio, about legacy, about how proud he was to take care of things. And every time he said that, I felt a strange calm settle over me, not bitterness, not grief, but resolve. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was restoring balance. There's a difference. Revenge wants pain. Restoration wants recognition. And I knew, when the moment came, he wouldn't lose the money first. He would lose the illusion that he was the smartest person in the room. The moment came sooner than I expected, and not because I rushed it, but because confidence always makes people careless. Ethan invited me to lunch one afternoon at an upscale place downtown, the kind with linen napkins and waiters who spoke softly, as if money itself might overhear. He was relaxed, almost cheerful, talking about market performance and long-term growth, explaining how our strategy was paying off. I listened, nodding, letting him finish every sentence. Then I asked, gently, if something happened to you tomorrow, Ethan, who would control the assets? The question landed heavier than I'd intended. He paused just long enough to calculate, then smiled. It's all outlined in the operating agreement. You're protected. Protected. Not empowered, not in control. Protected like a child. I took a sip of water and said nothing more, and that silence unsettled him. A week later, his attorney contacted mine, not aggressively, just curious. That was the signal. The legal notice followed shortly after, a formal demand for accounting transparency under elder fiduciary standards. It wasn't an accusation. It was a requirement. Suddenly, Ethan wasn't the one answering questions. He was the one being asked. Requests for documentation multiplied. Advisors who once spoke only through him were now obligated to speak to me. The layered entities that once looked clever now looked suspicious under scrutiny. Fees had to be justified. Decisions had to be explained, and explanations, when examined closely, tend to unravel. Ethan called me that night, voice tight but controlled. "Mom, why are lawyers involved? This feels unnecessary." I kept my tone calm. So did losing control of $2 million without my informed consent. He tried to pivot, concern, frustration, even a hint of hurt, but none of it moved me, because for the first time the ground beneath him was shifting and he could feel it. He hadn't expected resistance. He hadn't expected me to understand the rules well enough to use them, and in that realization something fundamental cracked. Not the money yet, not the structure. The assumption that love equals silence, that age equals compliance, that a mother's trust is infinite and unguarded. That assumption was gone, and once it disappears, everything built on top of it becomes fragile. From that point on, the power dynamic changed in ways Ethan couldn't fully control, no matter how carefully he masked it. The calls became more frequent but less confident. He stopped explaining and started asking, subtly at first, then more directly. "Did someone put this idea in your head?" he asked one evening, his tone wrapped in concern that felt almost rehearsed. I answered honestly, "No, I finally listened to my own." That answer unsettled him more than anger ever could. Over the next few weeks, the investigation did its quiet work. Advisors distanced themselves. Emails grew formal. Meetings were documented. The forensic accountant uncovered inconsistencies Ethan couldn't smooth over with charm. Conflicts of interest he hadn't disclosed, compensation structures that benefited him disproportionately, decisions justified as protective that clearly served his control. None of it screamed criminality. It didn't need to. It whispered breach of duty, and in legal language, a whisper like that can echo very loudly. Ethan began dropping by unannounced, sitting in the same chair where he'd once sprawled comfortably, now perched on the edge like a guest unsure of his welcome. He talked about stress, about pressure, about how hard it was to manage expectations. I listened without interrupting, without rescuing him from the discomfort he'd created. When he finally said, "I never meant to hurt you," I met his eyes and replied, "Intent doesn't undo impact." That was the first time he looked away. Not in anger, not in defiance, but in recognition. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up over coffee. It was a reckoning, measured, deliberate, and irreversible. And somewhere in that understanding, the son I'd raised was confronting something far more frightening than losing money: the loss of unquestioned authority over the one person he assumed would never challenge him. The formal notice arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier, thick with legal weight and impossible to ignore. It wasn't dramatic, no accusations in bold letters, no threats, but it was devastating in its precision. The attorney laid out the findings plainly: failure to disclose material conflicts, overreach of fiduciary authority, misrepresentation by omission, and a recommendation for immediate restructuring under court supervision. Ethan's name appeared throughout the document, not as my son, not as protector, but as managing party under review. I read it once, then again, slowly, feeling something unexpected rise in my chest, not triumph, not sadness, but relief. Relief that the truth no longer depended on my voice alone, that it existed now on paper, validated, undeniable. Ethan called within the hour. This time there was no attempt at composure. His voice cracked, anger and fear colliding. "How could you do this to me?" He demanded, as if I'd vandalized something precious. I waited until he finished, until the silence forced him to hear himself. Then I said quietly, "I didn't do this to you. You did this when you decided I didn't need to know." He argued, of course. He said he'd protected me, that I would have panicked, that I didn't understand how complicated things had become. I let him talk, because people reveal more when they think they're defending themselves. When he finally ran out of breath, I told him the outcome, not as a threat, but as fact. The court-appointed restructuring would remove him as sole manager. The assets would be reallocated into a trust where I held exclusive authority. Any compensation he'd taken beyond disclosed terms would be reviewed. And the $2 million, the center of it all, would return intact to where it had always belonged. There was a long pause, then softer, smaller. "So that's it?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "That's the beginning." Because what he had lost wasn't just control of money. He had lost access to my silence. And once silence is reclaimed, it doesn't come back quietly. The weeks that followed were quieter on the surface, but beneath that calm, everything was changing. Court filings moved forward. Accounts were audited, restructured, reassigned. The $2 million, my $2 million, returned in stages, like something long buried finally being uncovered piece by piece. I watched the numbers settle back where they belonged, not with joy, but with a steady sense of closure. Ethan stopped calling. Not out of anger, I think, but because he no longer knew what to say. The version of me he understood, the accommodating mother, the patient listener, the woman who trusted first and questioned later, no longer existed. In her place stood someone he hadn't prepared for, a woman who knew the value of what she had built and refused to let it be quietly repurposed by someone else's ambition. Word traveled through the family, as it always does. Some relatives avoided me. Others reached out with awkward sympathy. A few admitted they'd suspected something but hadn't known how to speak up. I didn't hold it against them. This wasn't about public opinion. It was about internal alignment, knowing that when I looked back on my life, this moment wouldn't be a footnote of regret. It would be a turning point. One afternoon, I received a short email from Ethan. No explanations, no justifications, just 4 words: "I understand now." I stared at the screen for a long time before closing my laptop. Understanding doesn't undo damage, but it does mark the end of denial. And for me, that was enough. I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in peace, the kind that comes when you no longer have to guard your own reality from the people closest to you. The end of this chapter didn't arrive with celebration or forgiveness. It arrived with stability. My life became quieter in the best possible way. Mornings returned to their rhythm. Walks felt lighter. Decisions were mine again, unfiltered, unquestioned. The trust was finalized under my sole authority, structured to provide lifelong care, flexibility, and dignity, everything that money is supposed to give when it's earned honestly and protected wisely. Ethan and I now speak rarely, and when we do, it is with boundaries so clear they no longer need explanation. There is sadness in that, yes, but no confusion. I didn't lose a son, I lost an illusion. And in exchange, I gained something far more valuable than $2 million. The certainty that my voice matters, even when it trembles, even when it's late, even when it speaks against someone I once loved unconditionally. This story isn't about revenge dressed up as justice. It's about awakening, about understanding that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. It often comes from those who believe your love gives them permission. If there is one truth I carry forward, it is this: age does not make you weaker, it makes you clearer. And when clarity finally arrives, no amount of manipulation can stand against it. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever trusted someone with your future and felt that trust quietly tested, remember this: awareness is not betrayal, and protecting yourself is not selfish. Your life, your money, and your dignity deserve respect at every age. If you value stories that reveal hard truths and real strength, subscribe to Silver Reckoning Hub. Here, we don't glorify revenge. We honor clarity, courage, and the power of standing up when it matters most.